sensory city. And in particular, we're looking at smell, taste, and touch. And then we'll be looking at nature in the city, and followed by a video lecture on walking in the city. So, I guess to start with, I just wanted to start with, we often take for granted the fact that our senses help us to orientate us in space. So they actually work together to provide us with an understanding of the environment around us. So it's not just based on one thing where, we seeing is the predominant thing and it's kind of in the hierarchy what we focus on. But we also hear things and we also feel the environment and we also taste it, we smell it, and all of these things give us a complete picture of the place that we're in, and also really impacts on us emotionally and how we feel in a place. And although we regularly think of our senses as separate and discrete, many of them actually rely on each other more than the other senses to generate a full comprehension of stimuli, such as the relationship between smell and taste. So usually when you can't smell well, you can't taste well either. We also been looking, well, something that has been mentioned, I'm not sure in this class in particular, but there is a hierarchical precedence that sight has been given in Western culture, and which develops both for biological reasons, such as the privileged position of our eyes on our face, and also for cultural reasons, such as the translation of oral histories into written visual histories, and through the development of the printing press. So that's basically, I guess, the predominantly in our culture. We record things through a written or a visual way, or through images. So that's how it seems to be a bit more privileged. Whereas there are many cultures as well that will actually record things in an oral history way or through song or through other forms. And it's not quite often, not remembered in that way. I just started with this particular artwork here, which is a work by a Beijing-based artist called Chang Xin. And he was part of the Biennale of Sydney quite some years ago. This was a work that I think he did before that. But he was very interested in the idea of taste. Sorry, I'm just going to hold this. He was very interested in the idea of taste and how the experience of tasting objects really actually is a different experience to actually seeing or hearing or smelling. And he focused on that in many of his performance works, and this was one of his early works called Communication Series. He felt that taste could be considered a form of communication and how you experience that. So just thinking about interconnection between the senses, Paul Rodaway in his critical text, Sensual Geographies, Body, Sense and Place, drew attention to the fact that the senses do not operate in isolation from one or another, but rather function together to produce a sensed environment. In Rodaway's view, the senses are connected to the body in a tangible and corporal manner, and both the body and the senses function with three-dimensional space to produce a sensed environment and place. Rodaway was building off the work of theorists like George Simmel, who we mentioned yesterday, who argued that the senses were social, that is, that the senses exist within a sociological context. So in 1908, Simmel actually undertook a project he called the sociology of the senses, by which he meant the study of the ways in which humans acknowledged and understood each other through the media of sensation, through the senses. So Simmel is very interested in how we feel in places, and his earlier book really kind of talked about how the blasé attitude, how that happens through the bombardment of experiences in an urban site. But we can only know each other through our senses. They are the only way we can perceive and understand the world around us, according to Simmel. So they therefore must be intrinsically linked to our understanding of sociology and culture. So Rodaway built off this sociological approach to the senses and argued that senses were also spatial, since they contribute to our understanding of and orientation within space. It is through our senses that we perceive both social relationships and spatial relationships. According to Rodaway, moreover, these senses work together to provide this social and spatial understanding, each contributing to our appreciation of our social and spatial context. So he actually argued that there were 5 distinct ways in which the senses are connected to produce a sense environment. So these 5 things are cooperation, hierarchy, sequencing, threshold, and reciprocal relations. I'll just explain what those are. So number 1, which is cooperation. The first is cooperation, where the senses work together to produce and experience an understanding of the sensed environment. The second is through hierarchy between the senses, where the responses of the different senses are weighted in importance, and a privileged role that the sense of sight has enjoyed for the past few centuries within Western culture, for example. I just wanted to ask you in the class, do you think that in Chinese culture there is that visual sight is preferenced over other senses? Did you think that? Do you think, or do you think in sort of Cantonese culture that people think about other senses as well, just as much as seeing? Okay, you're not sure? I mean, I think sort of, especially with sometimes smell is quite a big part of Chinese culture in some ways, in terms of like incense burning and things like that. But anyway, it's an interesting question. I just thought you might have some insights in there. And then, of course, we've got sequencing. So the third way in which the senses are interconnected is through the sequencing of senses, where one sense leads into another sense to produce an environmental appreciation. So the most obvious example here is probably the way in which the sense of smell leads into a sense of taste. So quite often you smell something before you even taste it, just like I can smell the KFC over there. And I was noticing actually at the train station the other day that I could smell the KFC far beyond the train station, and it did make me feel a little bit hungry and think of taste. So this is the point at which one sensation reaches the level that another sense is engaged. We could also look here at the threshold for sensory perception itself. The final of the 5 ways in which the senses are interconnected to produce a sensed environment, according to Rodaway, is through a reciprocal relationship with an object. So what Rodaway means by this is that we're talking about how one thing can indicate another. So it occupies, so just say we're looking at through the senses which are functioning to sense the environment. So if you're thinking about, for example, humans both touch and are touched. They hear things, but they're also heard. They smell and they are smelt, so on. So you might produce a particular sense, but then you also feel that particular sense. So our senses exist within a reciprocal relationship, social relationships to both objects and other humans. Okay, so today we're going to specifically look at different ways in which the artists have engaged these different senses within their work. Although we are all aware that the senses are interconnected and every work of art engages more than one sense, I'm going to go through these works systematically by looking at works categorically according to the particular sense that they highlight. And some particular artists will say that they're more focused on a particular sense in their work, even though it might not be really, you know, there is a visual part of it, but maybe they focus more on the smell or the taste. I mean, like in particular with Chung Sin's work, he really was trying to emphasise the sense of taste in that work, even though it had a visual outcome. Okay, so just as you can see here, this is a film still from a film called Orchestra of Exiles, and in that particular scene there is a blind audition happening. So the musician at the background is actually playing, but this, I guess this judge is trying to not look at the musician himself, just to ensure that he's not being prejudiced while he's looking at, listening to the music. He's actually paying attention to listening rather than looking at the person himself. Okay, so we'll just look at some examples of touch. So Art in Touch was a collective from Britain who worked with touch, and they have written in their manifesto that cultural habits around touching and over-dependence on sight and the disembodying forces of technology serve to unmoor us from the sensuous world, from the corporal basis of our intelligence. And they argue that in this context, multisensorial art has purpose and urgency about it. So, So, of course, there is one particular category of art where touching is tacitly permitted. So public artworks are often positioned in such a way that they encourage physical engagement through the encounter. So, and I guess also with even traditional public artworks, they are designed to be looked at, but I guess there is, usually when they are put into public, there is an assumption that perhaps there will be some contact between people and the work. So in many respects, when you look at a very traditional piece of public art that's a bronze sculpture of a figure, they're designed to be hard-wearing, and it doesn't matter if you touch it because it's not going to fall apart. But it is designed with that idea in mind that you might actually physically encounter it. And so some works are often used as a makeshift from public furniture and even escape ramps, such as Petra Sprott's architectural fragment, which I don't have an image of. But this particular artwork here is Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate, which is in Chicago, and it really was a work that was designed for people to engage with. He actually purposely made the surface as shiny as possible, and it was all about surface, this work. And it's an incredibly popular public piece of artwork where people have really engaged with it, and they love it. Appeals to a very wide range of people. Something very interesting that Anish Kapoor did recently was that he's actually been recently experimenting a lot with the different types of paint. And he's created a new type of paint called, I'll show you actually, it's called Vanta Black. And it's the blackest black that you can possibly make. It's the densest black. There's no light in it at all. And I think he's been working on it for a very long time. So the paint that he's created is actually copyrighted to him. But recently he actually revisited Cloudgate, and knowing that it's such a popular work because of the interaction with the surface, he actually repainted the whole work last year and unveiled it back in the same site to the public, and changed the whole meaning of the work actually by creating a work which is actually much more about introspection, disorientation, lost in nothingness. And I guess the reason he did that was to actually show that he could completely change the sensorial response to a work through the colour, and really kind of demonstrated that on a very large scale. And so, but not all artworks permit touching. Some custodians of public works use fences and other kinds of barriers and mechanisms of separation to prevent the work from being touched. So So the classic example is the plinth for the public artwork, or the monument, which might keep the work out of reach of people, though not other potential risks of degradation like the elements or pigeons. The public sculpture park in Seattle, as we can see here on the left, has a policy of not touching the public artworks, which is enforced by invigilators. So even in a public space, the modern trope is not of not touching the art can persist. I also happened to be walking past Tyson Place the other day and just thought it was quite hilarious that I saw this big sign that said, well, there was this, I guess it was a sculpture, it was in a commercial business, but it had a big please do not sign, do not touch sign, and with a little statement saying Sally will cry underneath, so I just thought that was pretty cute. And I thought relevant to the topic. But also these ideas of do not touch actually really taps nicely into Foucault's ideas of the docile body and this idea of normalisation, teaching us to actually behave in particular ways that are normalised to a society. And then there are some artworks that can shift from one category to another, from touchable to not touchable. So this kind of quite often happens sometimes when perhaps the artist's intentions are not kept to the true kind of spirit of it, I guess. This is Indian sculptor Savod Gupta's work, who actually installed this work at the Frieze Art Fair in London, where the audience was able to get really up close to the work and even touch the work. And he often works with very everyday objects, but he often, does invite people to actually really engage with the work by physically touching it. I recently saw his work at the National Gallery of Victoria. He had a solo exhibition, and it was in a completely different context, still using the same sorts of materials, but you really couldn't touch the work, and you weren't invited to touch the work, being in that gallery context. But his same work was actually shown at the Venice Biennale, and but in this context, because it was the Venice Biennale, they actually did display it in a way that sort of sat back from the audience, so you couldn't really get close to it, you couldn't really interact with it. So it was a different experience that you had of the work. And the interesting thing about that is that at that point, that work had been purchased by a collector. So the collector probably didn't might have changed the politics of how people engage, because the collector probably didn't want people touching the work and perhaps potentially destroying it. Okay, so this is an Australian artist, Charlie Sofo. Many artworks invoke the sense of touch through sight. In a kind of sequencing, as Rodaway would describe it, this work by Melbourne-based artists does just that by appealing to the memories we might have of touching particular surfaces. So he's an interesting artist. His works are never quite monumental. They're very intimate, and he often focuses on things that are the minutiae of life. So it is, for him, his works, it is about just the sensation of touch and how memories can be released by that sensation. And that was actually a particular work that was made for the Anne Lander Video New Media Art Award at the Art Gallery of New South Wales a couple of years ago. And then we've got people like Valley Export, who we saw the work of in an earlier lecture, and you've probably seen her work a few times, but this particular work that she did in 1968 was very much a feminist work, and she really focused on the objectification of women and the sensuous touch point of, and how she framed her own body in a very awkward way to sort of replicate sort of a cinematic experience, and actually gave people the permission to touch her female body. And then the awkward part about her performance was that her because her head was exposed, she was actually looking at the particular people that were actually participating and creating a very awkward moment, and then also making people realise, I guess, the way women's bodies are treated in media representations, and in particular in film and in advertising. Then we've got people like Marina Abramovich and Ule. This is one of their earlier performances that they did together when they were still a couple. Have you come across Marina's work before? Yeah. So there's a fantastic documentary about Marina that came out a few years ago, which I do highly recommend you see. It's quite touching. It's about her career and her building up to her big show that she had at, I think it was at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. But it was about that kind of the journey that she'd taken, and also about her relationship with Ule, who was her life partner for many years, and also a collaborating artist that worked with her when she was younger. But they actually separated, so they kind of took really quite an intense journey together, and they actually didn't see each other for a long period of time. But the film is quite interesting and worth seeing if you're interested in performance art. But in this particular work, these are the kind of works that really brought attention to Marina Abramovich. They were really challenging works, using the body and confronting people in spaces with the body. And I think, in this particular work, they sort of created a living door, and, it made you realise how, awkward that the intervention could be. And the final artist in the, just talking about touch, the final artist that we're looking at here is the Cuban-American artist Felix González-Torres. And González-Torres transformed the everyday into profound poetic statements within his work. So in this particular case, a declaration on loss and love, this work was about. It's actually a pile of candies that he created. The work's actually called Untitled, Portrait of Ross in LA. And from 1991, he created this big pile of 175 pounds of candy, which was 175 pounds being the ideal weight of his partner, Ross, who actually became very ill and actually passed away from AIDS in 1991. But what actually happened was that González-Torres actually it had a huge impact on his partner getting sick, and seeing him deteriorate over time and lose weight and suffering, and then eventually dying. And so the work came to be a representation of someone that he dearly loved, and candy being something that's very affectionate to a lot of people. It was a metaphor for him and his journey through suffering, and people at the gallery were actually encouraged to take the candies and eat them, and by the end of the exhibition the pile had deteriorated into a very small pile. Okay, then just looking at the notion of smell, it's actually been argued that the sense of smell has been given very low status when the senses were being re-evaluated in the 18th and 19th century by philosophers and scientists. So smell was considered to be primitive, savage and bestial, to use the words of British olfactory artist James Auger. So smell is certainly the one sense where control seems least available. It is more difficult to zone out or our noses than it is to block out sound or sight or taste or touch. And the immediacy of smell is also one of its strengths, since it can provide an effective and emotive experience. So through the provision of certain aromatic stimuli, artists can transport audiences to places of sincere meaning without the need for language. Have you ever had the experience where you've been in a place that you're not familiar with, but you've smelt a certain thing and felt you were taken back to that place? Yeah. I often have that, especially when I'm in the Chinatowns of Melbourne and walking through the street. There's a particular kind of cooking oil smell that I only ever smell in Hong Kong. But then when I'm in Melbourne, I only smell that in Chinatown. And it's quite interesting. I'm in Melbourne, but suddenly I feel like I've been transported to Asia. Smells have the potential to function pre-linguistically and effectively as they evoke physical and emotional responses from the body without the need to engage the conscious mind. You might also think about how the French are really obsessed with perfume, and that kind of culture really did grow out of a very smelly city and pollution, and it was as a way of dealing with smells that they couldn't control, which are probably horrible sewers and rubbish and just badly managed cities. A culture of aromatherapy and also perfumes developed from that, so it's quite interesting. So this is actually arguably the first specifically olfactory artwork, contemporary artwork. Marcel Duchamp's 50cc of Paris Air from 1919 consists of a ready-made ampule Duchamp bought from a chemist in Paris, which he opened and filled with Paris Air before sealing it and transporting it to the US. So when displayed in a museum environment, the work is really the nothingness inside the ampule rather than the ampule itself. Although we know air consists of molecules, it appears invisible to us. So the question that we're asking ourselves is, so would the air smell of Paris, and what does that even mean? How do you encapsulate a singular representation of smell of Paris in a smell? The question I'd like to ask you is, how would you encapsulate Hong Kong in a smell if you had the chance to? What are some of the things for you that remind you of home? Anything in particular? I kind of think of a mixture of cooking smells and sort of maybe incense smells sometimes, people burning incense on the streets, and maybe pollution smells, rubbish smells.
See.
Anyway, something to think about. So anyway, we just sort of wonder, does this work exist at all? Is there actually work there? So, of course, artists have evoked the sense of smell before without needing to smell the smell to be present. So they were happy to work with representations. So here we see a pre-Raphaelite romantic painting by the English painter John Williams Waterhouse, and like other romantic painters, was entranced by the relationship between nature and culture. And you know, just looking at this painting, you probably actually can conjure up what the smell of the rose is when you look at the way she's behaving. There was actually, this is a group called this is a work called The Greatest Hits, which was made by a collective called Air Aroma, and it was shown in Melbourne a few years ago. In relation to other artists that have this particular artist, Martinka Warinsniak, actually worked with Hunter College Chemistry Department to extract hair oil, sweat and tears from the body in order to create a self-portrait using not paint but other traditional materials, from her own biological materials. So the artist said she wanted to create a self-portrait that was completely stripped of the visual prejudice that we usually associate with judging a person or judging a woman specifically. So they actually perfumed her and created a self-portrait of herself in that way. And then Karsten Holler is another artist that was a biologist who became an artist. And with her chemistry kind of background, she actually, this is a work that it's actually a pair of sex swings, a mattress and a light bulb and syringes filled with the chemical aphrodisiac PEA. And PEA actually stands for phenethylamine, phenylethylamine, it's hard to pronounce, an organic compound that is reputed to be a mood enhancer. So it is actually found in chocolate, and it's suspected of having a psychoactive effect and is attributed to some as altering one's pheromones, the body's chemical signals. So these signals are actually picked up by the nasal organ within the nose, so it's actually an organ that's inside. So the smelling of the pheromones is an auxiliary olfactory sense. So anyway, she was investigating that relationship between smell and, I guess, attraction. So this is in another bodily work for the Florence Biennale in 1997. American artist Jenny Holzer collaborated with fashion designer Helmut Lang to create an installation entitled "I Smell You on My Clothes." So Helmut Lang's a very well-known fashion designer. The two artists custom designed a space that the audience would enter, and then at various points along the space deposited scent emitters that emitted a custom scent, which was in fact the smell of human skin. And this scent has been described as both familiar and foreign, since the smell of skin is rarely encountered on its own. That's true, actually. Usually it's a mixture of smells that are from your chemicals in your body and other things. So this familiar but unfamiliar response is known as Freudian theory as the uncanny. So the work of the German artist Wolfgang Leib might be said to elicit a similar response. So Leib's work uses natural materials including milk, pollen, beeswax, rice and marble. And these natural substances all have strong scents that we may or may not be able to place within the gallery. So his work is difficult to categorise since it has a relationship to land art, minimalism and process art. And for his pollen works, one of which we see on the screen, Leib collects pollen from his local area, working with the natural cycle of plants blooming. So he works with hazelnut, dandelion, other flowers and pine pollens within his practice. So this is the kind of work that really doesn't translate when you look at on the screen, and quite a few of these works, because you actually don't actually have that experience of actually smelling the work. So here we have the temples of meat that were actually created by the Belgian artist Jan Fabre, who engages with built environments and places slices of Parma ham over the pillars at the entrance of the Museum of Modern Art here in Belgium. So the artist actually hoped that the 8,000 slices of ham would attract flies and create a living sculpture at the entrance of the gallery. So the artist himself said that good art must stink a bit, and stated that he used ham with fat to create a marble effect on the pillars. And the rotting meat has a pungent smell and has to be held in place with plastic sheeting. And then this is the smell of food, whether abject and repulsive or mouth-watering and appealing, certainly elicits an effective response in the visitor. Brazilian artist Ernesto Neto has worked with this response across his practice. So this particular work, Just Like Drops of Rain, Nothing, was shown at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in 2002, and consisted of stretched polyamide material that traced and mirrored the architectural space, filled with substances like turmeric or lead shot that had particularly strong smells. Entering the space created a multi-sensorial experience with sight and smell led to an anticipated taste response. Okay, so looking at taste, so the final sense we will look at today, sense of taste, is immediately connected to all the other senses according to many sensorial theorists. And this truly multisensorial experience is also connected to memory and nostalgia, as the individuals bring with them their own personal history to the work. It seems logical to start with this section by looking at not an artist but a chef, who may well be described as an artist by some. So this is a quote from Heston Blumenthal. Has anyone heard of Heston? Heston has a show on a cooking show it's screened in Australia, but if you look him up on YouTube, you'll also be able to find him. He's a bit of an extreme, I guess you'd call him an extreme chef. He quite often looks back at history and then recreates feasts from the past. So I remember watching one episode where he looked at sort of what King Henry VIII would have been eating, what kind of banquets he would have, and he recreated these big banquets and then invited a whole group of well-known English people to actually come and experience it. And he always does the most dramatic kind of feasts that you could possibly do. So he's a good person to comment on food and art, I guess. And of course I want to create food that is delicious, but this depends on so much more than simply what's going on in the mouth context. History, nostalgia, emotion, memory and the interplay of sight, smell and sound and taste all play an important part in our appreciation and enjoyment of food. And I'm sure you as Hong Kongers would appreciate that statement, because food culture is such a big part of Hong Kong. So this is actually Gordon Matter Clark's work, and the idea of food as art can probably be traced to Gordon Matter Clark's collaboration with Caroline Houdini called Simply Food. So food was actually a relational artwork born of the time in which it was created. And at the end of the 1960s, artists were keen to escape from exhibiting within the white cube while in search of places to work in a studio, sleep and eat. So Matt Clark actually came up with this idea of food to meet at least the last of these needs and to create a space for communal artistic stimulation and exchange. So food became a place for artists to work and eat. It functioned for 3 years on the Lower East Side in New York, and it spurred many artists working at the time through the creative collaborative environment of the space. I've actually quite some years ago, I worked in Beijing around year 2000 to 2002, and because a lot of things, the city was changing very fast, there was a lot of experimentation going on at that time as well, and I did find that because food is a big part of Chinese culture, that a lot of artists actually were opening restaurants at that time, and I don't know if it's as popular now, but there was quite a few artists that opened restaurants. Like Fang Lijun opened a big restaurant, and these kind of places, I think even Ai Weiwei had a nightclub, or a bar, but it was a gathering place. And the very interesting thing about that period of time was that these restaurants actually became artists' haunts. They were places where artists would meet in the middle of the night to talk about ideas and to work on projects together. And that was a big part of the development of the art community at that time. And then just in terms of food, probably one of the most well-known and most talked about works that related to food was the Thai artist Rikrat Veneja, whose work, untitled 1992, played a fundamental role in changing art galleries of the 90s. So the reason why Rikrat Veneja gets mentioned so much is that because he was curated into the and written about by Nicholas Bourrier, who wrote Relational Aesthetics, which was a very well-known book that was all about this emergence of participatory art in the 90s. And in particular, this work, he actually recreated his kitchen and made Thai curries in the gallery and served them up to his audience. And the work was actually about bringing people together through a participatory act and through the act of eating and building relationships. And it's been extraordinarily influential, this work, even though maybe it doesn't seem like such a complex idea, but it had a really huge influence on people. Okay. And, okay, so anyway, I've come to the end of this lecture, and it's good timing actually. So this is actually, just to end with, in terms of taste, this is the work of the Hotham Street Ladies, who were a group of female artists in Melbourne, and they're all individually artists in their own right. But they recently have been doing projects together, and I guess trying to play on kitsch female Australian culture by using cakes and cake decoration and food in their installations. And a couple of years back they were invited to do a big installation, a whole lounge room setting, which is completely made of icing, cake icing, for the Melbourne Now exhibition. And they're sort of quite cheekily playing, they call themselves, they've written sign Bakesy, obviously referencing Banksy, but sort of the female side of it. But it's really, you know, just drawing attention to, I guess, perhaps an unheard voice of, you know, the sort of the kitsch female voice. And that brings me to the end of the lecture on the sensory city. So I thought what I'd do is quickly, I'm just going to call out the role, and I've been given some cultural sensitivity advice to not attempt to pronounce the names correctly and just read them as English names because it will make you laugh too much. That's what I've been told. So I'm going to pronounce them as English names. Okay, Al Ho Lam,